Grandpa always told me, family is the most dangerous thing in the world if you can't trust them. I never truly understood what he meant, until the day I pulled up to his house and saw a sold sign staked into the front yard. At first, I thought there had to be a mistake. Maybe it was the wrong house, maybe the sign was for another property nearby, but as I stepped out of my car, something in my gut told me otherwise. I knew this house like the back of my hand. The creaky wooden porch, the chipped blue paint on the front door, the garden Grandpa used to tend every morning. This was his house, my house. I marched up the front steps, expecting to use my key, but it didn't fit. My stomach twisted. Someone had changed the locks. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called my mother. The phone rang once, twice, then she picked up. "Hey, Mom, I'm at Grandpa's house. There's a sold sign in the yard. What's going on?" Silence. Then, after a long pause, she sighed. "Oh, right. We meant to tell you about that." "We?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. "Tell me what?" "Your uncle and I talked it over with the family. We sold the house. It's gone, sweetheart." It took a second for the words to sink in. They sold the house. My house. The home Grandpa had left to me in his will. The place where I'd spent countless summers as a kid, sitting on the porch while he shared stories about his past, laughing over home-cooked meals, learning how to fix things around the house with him. Every memory I had of him was tied to this place, and they sold it, without telling me. "You what?" I choked out. "Sweetheart, calm down. It wasn't a big deal. We all agreed it was for the best," she said, as if she was discussing the weather. "You don't need a big old house like that. We figured—" "You figured?" My voice was shaking now. "Who gave you the right to make that decision? It was mine." "Technically," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "it was Grandpa's, and we're family. We had to do what was best for everyone." My grip on the phone tightened. "So you sold it, behind my back, and didn't even think to tell me?" "Well, we didn't want you to get emotional about it." I almost laughed. Didn't want me to get emotional? The audacity, the absolute betrayal. My heart pounded in my chest. "Who bought it?" I demanded. "Does it matter? Who? Bought? It?" She sighed again, this time irritated. "Some couple. We didn't ask too many questions. The money was wired over, and it's done." My vision blurred with rage. It was done? They thought they could just brush it under the rug, pretend like it never happened? I hung up before I could say something I'd regret. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. I barely remember the drive home. My mind was racing, thoughts overlapping in a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to get them. The next morning, I was sitting in my lawyer's office, hands still trembling with frustration. I shoved the will across his desk. "They sold my house," I said, my voice raw. "I need to know if there's anything I can do." He picked up the document and began scanning it, his brows furrowed. He flipped a few pages. His eyes moved faster. Then suddenly, his expression changed. His lips curled into a smirk. "Well, well." He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "Looks like your family made a pretty big mistake." My heart leaped. "What do you mean?" He turned the will toward me, pointing to a section near the bottom. The fine print. "Your grandfather was smart," he said. "He put in a reversion clause. The house was left to you unconditionally, but with one very specific rule. It cannot be sold without your explicit written consent." I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. So, he said with a slow smile, "that sale they made? It's illegal. It never should have happened. The new owners don't actually own anything." A slow, burning satisfaction spread through my chest. My family thought they had outplayed me, thought they could take what was mine without consequence. But Grandpa had outplayed them. And now, it was my turn. My fingers traced the fine print of the will as my lawyer explained everything in detail. Grandpa had set up a reversion clause, a legal safeguard to ensure that, no matter what, the house could never be sold without my approval. My family, in their rush for money, had either ignored it or never even bothered to read it. A bubbling mixture of anger and satisfaction grew inside me. They thought they were in control. They thought they had won. But the house was still mine. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. "So, what happens now?" My lawyer smirked. "Now? We take back what's rightfully yours. It was time to let my family and the buyers know that they had made a huge mistake. I didn't wait. That same day, I called my mother and told her we needed to talk. I didn't mention the fine print. I didn't give anything away. If my family had taught me one thing, it was that the element of surprise was a powerful weapon. We met at my parents' house. My uncle was there too, along with a couple of my aunts, probably the same ones who had schemed behind my back. They were relaxed, smug even. It made my blood boil. "So," my uncle said, stretching back on the couch, "you finally decided to move on?" I kept my expression neutral. "Not exactly. I spoke to my lawyer today." That got their attention. My mother shifted in her seat. My uncle sat up straighter. "Turns out," I continued, pulling out a copy of Grandpa's will, "you forgot to read the fine print." I let the words hang in the air for a moment before setting the document down on the table in front of them. "You had no legal right to sell that house." Silence. For the first time, they looked uneasy. My uncle picked up the papers, skimming through them, his brows furrowed. This can't be right," he muttered. "It's right," I said, arms crossed. "The sale was illegal. The house was never yours to sell." My mother opened her mouth, probably to argue, but I wasn't finished. "So now, the new owners have a very big problem." I leaned forward, staring my uncle dead in the eye. "And you have an even bigger one." I didn't waste any time. My lawyer drafted the official paperwork, declaring the sale null and void. We sent it directly to the buyers, a wealthy couple who had apparently bought the house for an insane price, thinking they had found a charming, historic property to renovate. When I got the call from the husband, I was expecting anger. I wasn't disappointed. "You're telling me," he snapped, his voice tight with barely restrained rage, "that we spent all this money, signed all the contracts, and now we don't actually own the house?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," I replied. "My family scammed you. They had no legal right to sell it." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then, "This is unacceptable." His voice dropped, colder now, dangerous. "They're going to regret this." I almost smiled. Good. Let them feel what it's like to be blindsided. The buyers wasted no time launching legal hellfire on my family. Lawsuits, refund demands, threats of fraud charges. Within days, my family was buried under a mountain of legal problems they couldn't escape from. And me? I had my house back. But I wasn't done yet. The lawsuits hit my family like a hurricane. The wealthy couple who had bought the house weren't just any ordinary buyers. They were connected, powerful, and absolutely livid that they had been tricked into purchasing a house that was never legally for sale in the first place. It started with refund demands. My uncle, my mother, my aunts, they were all named in the legal documents. The buyers wanted every penny back, plus damages, and they weren't asking nicely. My phone started ringing nonstop. First, it was my mother. "Sweetheart, listen, we need to talk. This is getting out of control." "Out of control?" I repeated, voice dripping with disbelief. "You mean the mess you created? The one where you sold something you didn't own?" "Look, we made a mistake, okay? We dash." "You didn't make a mistake," I cut her off coldly. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't think you'd get caught." She tried to spin it, tried to soften it, but I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. I hung up. Then came the call from my uncle. "You don't understand how bad this is," he snapped the moment I answered. "They're threatening to sue us for fraud. Fraud. Do you have any idea how much money this could cost?" I leaned back, completely calm. "You should have thought about that before you screwed me over." There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing heavily through the phone. For the first time in my life, he sounded scared. "Listen," he finally said, his voice quieter. "What do you want?" "You've made your point. The house is yours. What do you need for this to go away?" I almost laughed. He still thought I could be bought off. "There's nothing you can offer me," I said flatly. This is justice." I hung up before he could say another word. I could only imagine the chaos happening behind the scenes, my family scrambling, desperately trying to find a way out of the mess they had created. They were drowning in legal fees, stress, and the looming threat of a court battle they couldn't win. And I wasn't lifting a finger to help them. But I wasn't finished yet. Getting the house back was only part of my revenge. The other part? Making sure they never benefited from Grandpa's legacy again. I thought about keeping the house, moving in, restoring it to its former glory. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it didn't feel the same anymore. The house had been tainted by their greed. So I made a decision. I sold it. But not just to anyone. I sold it to a developer, the very thing my family hated. The property had historic charm, the kind that preservationists fought to protect. My family had always loved the idea of keeping it in the family name. They bragged about it at every gathering, acting like it was some grand legacy they had built. Well, that legacy was about to be bulldozed. The developer had big plans that involved tearing down the house and replacing it with luxury townhomes. Expensive, modern, completely soulless. The exact opposite of everything Grandpa's house represented. And the best part? I made sure the sale went public. My family found out the same way everyone else did, through the news. I could only imagine their faces as they read the headline, "Historic family home sold to developers. New luxury complex coming soon." The phone calls started again. First my mother, then my uncle, then my aunts. I ignored every single one. They deserved this. They had stolen something precious from me, and now I was making sure they never got to benefit from it again. Justice was finally served. The house was gone, not physically, not yet. But the moment the contracts were signed, the moment I handed over the deed, it was as good as demolished. I stood in front of it one last time, hands in my pockets, staring at the old porch where Grandpa used to sit, rocking in his chair, telling me stories about his youth. This was the house where I'd learned to ride a bike, where I'd spent summers drinking lemonade on the steps, where I'd once felt safe before my family had poisoned it with their greed. But I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel sadness. Because this wasn't Grandpa's house anymore. It was a battleground, a symbol of betrayal, a place they had tried to rip from me without a second thought. And now, it was being torn down. The backlash from my family was instant. They had already been furious when I took the house back, but selling it to a developer, that was unforgivable in their eyes. My mother left me voicemails, her tone bouncing between desperation and fury. "How could you do this?" she wailed in one. "Your grandfather would be so disappointed in you." The guilt trip. In another, she was angrier. "You're just being petty now. You got the house back? Wasn't that enough for you?" My uncle sent a text that was short but dripping with rage. "You'll regret this. You've destroyed the family name. You're dead to us." Good. They had expected me to roll over, to forgive and forget. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The day the demolition was scheduled, I made sure to be there. I leaned against my car, arms crossed, watching as the heavy machinery rumbled into place. A crowd had gathered. Some curious locals, some preservationists who were protesting the loss of a historical landmark. And of course, my family. They stood off to the side, watching with horror as the bulldozer positioned itself in front of the house. My mother looked like she was on the verge of tears. My uncle was muttering angrily under his breath. One of my aunts was shaking her head, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. I didn't say a word to them. I just watched. The bulldozer's engine roared to life. Then, with a thunderous crack, the first wall came down. My mother gasped. My uncle turned red with anger. I smiled. The house was reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. Dust and debris filled the air, the last remnants of my grandfather's home disappearing under the force of progress. It was poetic in a way. They had tried to erase my connection to the house. So, I erased theirs. With the money from the sale, I could have done anything. Bought a new house, traveled, started fresh somewhere else. But as I sat down to go through the paperwork, I found myself thinking about Grandpa. He had always been about helping people who actually deserved it. So I made a decision. Instead of pocketing the money, I used it to start a charity in his name. A foundation dedicated to helping underprivileged kids, giving them the opportunities that my greedy, selfish family never would have. I even made sure the charity's headquarters was built right where the house once stood, a permanent reminder, a monument to what had been lost, but also to what had been rebuilt. Months later, my family had all but fallen apart. The lawsuits had drained them, the legal fees, the refunds to the scam buyers, the utter destruction of their reputation. It had left them financially ruined. My uncle had to sell his own house to cover the debts. My mother? She moved into a small apartment, far from the life of comfort she had once known. None of them had the courage to reach out to me again, but I heard through the grapevine that they still hated me, hated what I had done, hated that I had won, and that was the sweetest revenge of all.